I sit alone in this cramped office, the air heavy with the musty scent of old paper. My desk lamp flickers, casting jagged shadows across stacks of case files, yellowed, brittle pages that hold the ghosts of a century past. I trace my fingers over the faded ink, the words blurring into a name that chills me every time I read it. Hinterkaifeck, a tiny farmstead lost in the wilderness of Bavaria, 43 miles north of Munich, where on March 31, 1922, 6 souls were extinguished in a storm of blood and steel. More than 100 years have passed, and still, I can't shake the question gnawing at me. Who wielded that Mattock, and why does this case refuse to die? I'm not Georg Gruber, the weary inspector who first tackled this nightmare in 1922. He walked away defeated, his notes a tangle of dead ends and desperation, leaving the mystery to rot. I'm just a shadow in his wake, an outsider with no badge, driven by an obsession I can't explain. I've spent nights hunched over these reports, piecing together fragments, conflicting witness accounts, a crime scene defiled by careless hands, and the sickening truth that whoever killed the Gruber family didn't flee. They stayed, for days, eating their bread, tending their cattle, sleeping under the same roof as the bodies they'd broken. What kind of creature does that? Human or something worse? Or picture Hinterkaifeck in your mind. Not the quaint farmstead of storybooks, but a lonely speck swallowed by a sea of dark pines. The wind howled through its warped boards, a constant wail that masked every other sound. That's where they lived. Andreas Gruber, 63, a man whose hands were as rough as his temper, known to wield a scythe or a pitchfork against anyone who crossed him. Cäzilia, his 72-year-old wife, a silent figure worn down by decades of his cruelty. Viktoria, their 35-year-old daughter, a widow with secrets buried in her eyes. Her children, 7-year-old Cäzilia, bright and curious, and 2-year-old Josef, still in his bassinet. And Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, stepping into this doomed house on the very day it became a tomb. 6 lives, snuffed out one by one, leaving nothing but silence and questions. I've replayed that night in my head 1,000 times. No cries pierced the forest. No lantern flared in distress. Just the endless dark, the creak of the house and a presence. Maybe in the attic. Maybe crouched in the barn's shadows. What happened there wasn't just a crime. It was a descent into madness, a riddle written in blood and straw. And then there's Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who stumbled onto the carnage, or so he claims. He found the bodies, yes, but his hands were too steady, his words too careful. I've read his statements, pored over his actions, and I can't shake the feeling he's more than a witness. Did he see something? Or did he do something? I'm taking you back there with me, step by careful step, through the fog of half-truths and the stench of death that still lingers in these pages. This isn't about solving the case. Not anymore. It's about unearthing what's been buried, peeling back the layers of a nightmare that feels alive, watching us. Hinterkaifeck isn't just a place. It's a warning, a whisper from the void, and maybe, just maybe, a killer's final laugh. The wind never stopped at Hinterkaifeck. It was a restless, keening sound, curling around the farmstead like a predator circling prey. In the weeks before March 31st, 1922, that wind carried something else. Warnings, omens, signs that something was wrong. I've sifted through the testimonies, the scribbled notes from neighbors and the Gruber family's own words, and what I see isn't just a prelude to murder. It's a slow, creeping terror that gripped them long before the Mattock fell. 6 months earlier, the family's maid, Crescens Rieger, fled. She lasted less than a year, her departure sudden and frantic. Later, she told police she'd heard noises, footsteps, faint and deliberate, pacing the attic above her bed. She swore the place was haunted, that something unseen watched her through the walls. Andreas Gruber laughed it off, called her superstitious. But I wonder if he felt it too, the weight of eyes in the dark. Rieger's exit left a void, a silence that seemed to invite whatever was coming. Then, in March, the strange began to pile up. Andreas found a newspaper on the property, a Munich publication, crisp and foreign. He didn't subscribe to it. No one nearby did. He asked the postman, the neighbors, but no one claimed it. It sat on the kitchen table like an intruder, its presence unexplained. I've held that detail in my mind, turning it over. Was it a mistake? A taunt? Or had someone been there leaving a breadcrumb of their existence? Days later, a key vanished. Not just any key, the one to the farmhouse itself. Andreas searched every corner, tore apart drawers and cupboards, but it was gone. A house like Hinterkaifeck, isolated and vulnerable, relied on that lock. Without it, the boundary between safety and chaos dissolved. He didn't report it, stubborn old fool, but I can imagine his unease, the way he'd glance at the door, wondering what might walk through. Then came the footprints. Just days before the end, fresh snow blanketed the ground, pristine and untouched, until it wasn't. Andreas found them, a trail of tracks leading from the forest's edge to the farm's machine room. The lock there was broken, splintered wood gaping like a wound. He followed the prints, his breath fogging in the cold, but they stopped at the door. No tracks led away. Whatever or whoever had come from the woods was still there. He told neighbors about it, his voice gruff but shaken. That night, the family heard it. Footsteps again, heavier this time, thudding across the attic. Andreas climbed the ladder, lantern trembling in his grip, but found nothing. Empty boards, dust, shadows. He refused help, waved off the police. Pride or fear of what he might uncover? The final sign came from little Cäzilia, the 7-year-old. A school friend later recalled her words. Her mother, Viktoria, had fled the house the night before the murders, Thursday, March 30th. A fight with her parents, screaming, violent, drove her into the forest. Hours later, they found her, shivering and wild-eyed, but she wouldn't say why. Was it Andreas's temper? The secret of Josef's father? Or had she seen something in that house? Something that made her run? I see it all now. A tapestry of dread weaving tighter each day. The attic steps, the newspaper, the key, the tracks. They weren't random. They were a countdown. Something had chosen Hinterkaifeck, watched it, tested it. And on that last night, as Maria Baumgartner arrived with her sister, unaware she'd stepped into a trap, it was ready. The wind howled louder, but it couldn't drown out what was coming. March 31st, 1922. The sun sank behind the pines, bleeding red into the horizon, and Hinterkaifeck fell into shadow. I've walked that night in my mind, piecing it together from autopsy reports, witness statements, and the cold facts of the crime scene. What happened wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. It was a slaughter, methodical and merciless, and it started in the barn. The animals were restless that evening. Cows stamping, horses snorting. Maybe that's what drew Andreas out first. He stepped into the stable, his boots crunching on straw, lantern casting a weak glow. He didn't see the figure waiting, didn't hear the mattock, his own tool fashioned for slaughtering cattle, until it crashed into his skull. One blow straight through the right cheek, tearing his carotid artery. He crumpled, blood pulsing into the trough, dead in moments. The killer didn't stop to watch him bleed out. There were others to take. Cäzilia, the old woman, came next. Maybe she heard a thud, or Andreas's absence stretched too long. She shuffled out, hunched and frail, calling his name into the dark. The Mattock found her too, 8 savage strikes to the right side of her head, caving in her skull. She fell beside her husband, her nightgown soaking red, a heap of broken bones under the hay. The killer stacked a wooden door over them, a crude shroud, and waited. Viktoria followed, lured by the same unease. She was stronger, younger, but it didn't matter. 9 blows shattered her skull, each one a thunderclap in the silence. Strangulation marks bruised her neck. Did the killer's hands close around her throat first? A moment of rage before the weapon? She collapsed near her parents, her blood mingling with theirs. The little girl, Cäzilia, was last out there. 7 years old, she must have screamed when she saw them. The Mattock split her face, smashed her jaw, but didn't kill her outright. An iron band silenced her cries, and a pocket knife, Andreas's own, slit her throat. She lay in the straw, half naked, tearing at her own hair as life drained away, alive for hours in that hell. The killer crossed the yard then, boots silent on the frost, and entered the house. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, was in her room unpacking maybe or praying. She'd been there mere hours. One blow to the top of her head, another to her face, and she was gone, sprawled across her bed. Josef, the toddler, slept in his bassinet. A single strike crushed his tiny skull, the Mattock's edge biting deep. The house fell still, the wind outside the only sound. But the killer didn't leave. That's what haunts me most. They stayed. Over the next 3 days, someone fed the cattle, cut meat from the pantry, ate every scrap of bread in the kitchen. The calendar's March 31st page was torn off, April 1st staring blankly from the wall. Coffee sellers knocked on April 1st, Hans and Edward Shirofsky, but no one answered. They saw the machine room gate ajar, shrugged, and left. Mechanic Albert Hoffner came on April 4th, tinkering for hours, hearing only the dog's howls from the barn. The killer was there, watching, waiting, invisible. I've stood in that imagined silence, staring at the scene. 4 bodies stacked in the barn, 2 more inside, blood crusting on the floorboards. The Mattock, 80 centimeters of forged steel, its blade clamped with an 8mm screw, wasn't found until later, hidden in the attic. Whoever did this knew the farm, knew the family, knew how to vanish into its shadows. Was it rage? Revenge? Or something colder? Something that savored the aftermath? I can almost hear their breath, feel their eyes, as they moved through that dead house. A predator at home among the prey. Lorenz Schlittenbauer. His name keeps pulling me back, a thread I can't cut loose. He's the man who found the bodies, or so the story goes. A neighbor, a farmer, a widower with a tangled history tied to Viktoria Gabriel. But the more I dig into his role, the less he feels like a bystander. He's a shadow in this nightmare, and I'm starting to think he cast it. It was April 4th, 1922, when Schlittenbauer stepped into the frame. The Gruber family hadn't been seen since Friday. Church empty, Cäzilia absent from school. He sent his sons, Johann and Josef, to check the farm. They returned pale, saying no one answered. So he went himself, bringing Michael Pearl and Jakob Siegel as witnesses. The barn door was locked, the gate too, but Schlittenbauer didn't hesitate. He broke through, and there they were. Andreas, Cäzilia, Viktoria, and little Cäzilia, stacked like firewood under hay and a door. Blood soaked the straw, the air thick with death. Then he did something odd. He left Pearl and Siegel outside, pulled a key from his pocket, and unlocked the farmhouse door. Alone. Inside, he found Maria and Josef, their bodies cold in their beds. He moved them, shifted their positions, touched the scene, before calling the others in. Why? His friends asked later why he'd gone alone, risking a killer still lurking. His answer chills me. I had to see if my son was there. Josef, the 2-year-old, rumored to be his, born from a liaison with Viktoria after his first wife died in 1918. That key gnaws at me. Days before the murders, Andreas reported it missing. How did Schlittenbauer have it? He claimed Viktoria gave it to him, a lover's trust perhaps, but no one saw her do it. And why disturb the bodies? He said he was looking for survivors, but his hands left prints in the blood, smudged evidence we'll never recover. I see him in that house, calm where others would have screamed, methodical where panic should have ruled. His words betray him too. Years later, in 1925, a teacher caught him at the farm's ruins, staring at the rubble. The ground was too hard to bury them, he said, unprompted. How did he know the killer tried? The bodies were stacked, not buried. Frozen earth wasn't in the reports then. Was it a guess or a memory? He sued locals for calling him the murderer, won every case, but the whispers never stopped. They saw what I see. A man who knew too much. Schlittenbauer had motive. Viktoria, pregnant with Josef, might have demanded support, money, marriage, threatening his reputation. Andreas, her father, was a tyrant who'd beaten her, maybe learned the boy wasn't his. Did Schlittenbauer snap, luring them to the barn one by one? He knew the farm, the Mattock's hiding place, the rhythm of their lives. But if he killed them, why stay? Why eat their food, tend their animals? That's where the picture blurs. Rage doesn't explain the aftermath. I've studied his face in old photos. Weathered, hard, unreadable. He died in 1941, taking his secrets with him. But I hear his voice in those cryptic lines, see his shadow in the attic's dust. Was he the killer, swinging that mattock in a fury? Or did he find them dead, know who did it, and keep silent? He's the key, literal and figurative, and I can't turn away from him. Hinterkaifeck defies me. I've chased every lead, every theory, and still it slips through my fingers like smoke. Schlittenbauer looms largest, his shadow stretching across the case. But he's not the only ghost here. Others whisper from the edges, Andreas Gruber, Paul Muller, each with a story that could fit. Yet none feel complete. The truth, if it's here, is a shard buried too deep to grasp. Could Andreas have done it? The old man was a monster, violent, abusive, convicted of raping Viktoria. Maybe he learned Josef wasn't his, flew into a rage and turned the mattock on his own blood. The half-naked state of little Cäzilia, the slit throat, they fit his cruelty. He could have stayed, cooked, torn the calendar page, hiding in the barn until someone stopped him. But his death, bleeding out from a single wound, suggests another hand. Schlittenbauer, perhaps, finding him amid the carnage and finishing it. Then there's Paul Muller, the wild card, a German immigrant, suspected in American axe murders, Villisca, others, before vanishing around 1912. Bill James ties him to Hinterkaifeck. Isolated family, blunt weapon, stacked bodies, no theft. Did he sail home, resume his bloody work in Bavaria? The timeline fits, but evidence is thin. Newspaper speculation, not proof. Still, I see him in the forest footprints, a phantom from across the sea. I circle back to Schlittenbauer. The key, the disturbed scene, his words, they weigh too heavy to dismiss. Picture this. He goes to the farm that night, angry, desperate. Viktoria's demands, Andreas's threats, they push him over. He lures them out, kills them in the barn, then the house. He stays, not out of madness, but guilt, tending the farm as penance. Or maybe he arrives later, finds Andreas's work, and ends the old man in revenge for Josef. Either way, he knows more than he ever told. The case closed in 1955, no charges filed. The last suspect was questioned in 1986, then nothing. Hinterkaifeck was razed, its secrets burned or buried. But I see Schlittenbauer one last time, in 1925, standing amid the ruins. Hans Eblager asked why he was there. The ground was too hard to bury them, he said, eyes distant. A neighbor might guess that, sure, but the certainty in his voice, the way it hung in the air, feels like confession. So who was he? The killer, swinging that mattock in the dark. A witness, silencing Andreas to protect himself? Or just a man caught in the aftermath, knowing the truth but never speaking it? I'll never prove it. The files are cold, the farm dust, yet I hear the wind still, howling through those pines, carrying whispers no one can silence. Hinterkaifeck isn't done with us. It waits, a question without an answer, a shadow that moves when you look away.